Hello, guys and gals, and welcome. Welcome. So I've always had this question in the back of my head. I've always wondered which rune out of the 33 runes is the most versatile. Which one is the one that's like the most useful, the Swiss Army knife of the rune category? And I started to ask the question, and when I started to ask the question, I came up with a lot of more questions. And I really had to like break down my methodology as to what I considered useful and what I didn't consider useful. The first thing that I did was I came up with a list of how many times was it used in a rune word? How many times was it used in a cube recipe? And I came up with some answers, but the problem with those answers were that, well, a lot of those rune words just weren't really good. And they're not really very useful rune words, right? So things like venom and things like, like poor little, poor little like myth armor and things like that just generally don't see much usefulness, like in the game. They're okay, like in some situations, like if you're leveling up a barbarian and you just really happen to need a +2 armor. But there's a very good chance that you could end up with something better than myth armor in the grand scheme of things, especially since myth armor tends to make monsters run away, and venom tends to have like just no good stats on it whatsoever, and also happens to cost, I think, what is it, a mal rune? So I had to adjust the list, and I had to say to myself, well, I got to remove all these rune words that I deem kind of useless. And I didn't just go by my own understanding of this. I took a very long and hard look at all the rune words. I even went by my view count on my videos. So I took a look at all my rune word videos to see like which rune words were the most popular and which rune words were obviously not the most popular. And then I even made some exceptions for that because, you know, sometimes less popular rune words can still be highly useful. And so I adjusted the list by removing essentially all the rune words that I considered to be useless. But that's not where it ends. So there's a lot of recipes as well for transmuting items. So you can upgrade pieces of equipment, you can use rune words to craft pieces of armor, you can do all sorts of various things. Well, the cube recipes themselves are just unfortunately not all the most amazing in the entire world. Some of them are better than others, some of them are worse than others. And so what this invariably means is that I had to go through the cube recipes one by one, and I had to remove those as well. So anything that I deemed was a terrible recipe, I felt like those terrible recipes were just kind of like not really needed to be included in the list. And I was pretty strict about my application of whether a recipe was useful or not. Like, obviously, caster amulets definitely made it into the list, whereas some other things like, say, like the blood shield, on the other hand, which doesn't really have much usefulness, didn't make it to the list. And I just wanted to like break down the methodology of this first before we go through the process of talking about how versatile these runes are, and we're gonna do it one by one. So at the bottom of the list, the absolutely least versatile rune in the game, you are going to find the Zod rune. The Zod rune is only in 2 rune words. It is in Breath of the Dying, and it is in the Obsession rune word. And unfortunately, the usefulness of this particular rune, as far as its overall like rune word and cube recipes, it has 0 cube recipes. It has a whole 2 rune words that you can create with it. It's not really useful in just about any piece of equipment except for, say, weapons for the most part, with the occasional shield coming into play. But for the most part, you don't put Zod runes into armor unless, for some reason or another, there's no other way around it. In fact, you usually look for other ways to have your equipment be indestructible, like, you know, like the death rune word is indestructible, and so forth and so on. That way you have your indestructible without having to use up the rune socket for the indestructible. And so while there are some interesting uses for Zod runes, in the case of, say, like Zodding and Astrion's Iron Ward for like an ethereal version or something. For the most part, the Zod rune remains one of the least versatile runes in the game. It has essentially only three major uses. Number one is the Breath of the Dying rune word. Number two is the Obsession rune word. And number three is zodding an ethereal piece of equipment to prevent it from being destroyed. And there's not a whole lot of like really good candidates for Zod runes. Many people would tell you, yeah, you can Zod that, but that's pretty much just a waste of a Zod rune. So, how many items really are there in the game that are not just wastes of a Zod rune and actually is something that you would really want to use that Zod rune on? Like an ethereal Herald of Zakarum, for instance, which many would argue that an Eth Haz with a Zod rune in it is not really quite as good as a regular Haas upgraded with like a rune in it, as an example, which can be more useful. Yes, you get a little bit of defense with the Zod rune, but you don't necessarily get all the extra resistances and everything else that you could potentially put in there. Like you can put an increased attack speed, you could put a 1540 in there, you could put all sorts of other things into the socket. And that's one of the things that you have to take into account is that yes, the Zod rune can be useful to socket into a ethereal item, but a lot of the times a different rune or a different jewel or a different gem can be better in that same spot on a non-ethereal version. In fact, the Zod rune tends to be the only rune for weapons, though, because when you have an ethereal weapon that's not indestructible and you want to make sure that weapon never breaks, well, the Zod rune is your only choice. So it has about three uses in the entire game, essentially, for what it can do. The next most useless rune in the game is actually the Ohm rune. The Ohm rune has a total of 6 rune words that it can be used in. It has 0 cube recipes. It is useful to put into weapons on occasion for the 50% enhanced damage, but it is outplayed by 1540 joules in most situations, because in most situations you do need the increased attack speed alongside of the enhanced damage. And so the Ohm rune itself isn't necessarily the best choice in a large number of situations. Although there are a couple situations where the Ohm rune is preferred to the 1540, but that usually involves situations where you do not need attack speed. Next on the list is the Cham rune. The Cham rune is third on the list of the most useless runes in the game. And the reason why the Cham rune is so low is because, well, number one, Freeze's target is generally considered like bad manners in most cases, because your barbarians that are find iteming don't want you destroying their corpses. The Freeze's target also messes with necromancers, corpse explosion, assassins, corpse explosion, necromancers building their armies, and so forth and so on. The cannot be frozen is generally useless, and the problem is that there's a lot of really good other cannot be frozen options out there. Like there is Ravenfrost, there is Trangul's Belt, there is cannot be frozen that can be gotten from armors, and in general, you don't necessarily need the cannot be frozen in most situations. So the Cham rune has a total of 6 rune words that it can be used in, 0 cube recipes, and it is mildly useful for a 7th task of providing cannot be frozen if you're in one of those very rare situations where you have to have another cannot be frozen source besides one of the more readily available sources. Next on the list is the Sur rune for lack of usability or versatility. The Sur rune has hits blinds target, which is generally not something that you want to put into a weapon, because you usually reserve your weapon sockets for things that are going to help you more offensively as opposed to defensively. And the effect of increased maximum mana 5% or shields plus 50 mana isn't really amazing either. So it has a total of 7 rune words that it can be made into, that I would deem into the category of, like obviously useful rune words. Because keep in mind that obviously there may be more rune words than what I'm stating, but only 7 of them essentially made it onto my list. It has 0 cube recipes that it can be used in, of course, with the exception of upgrading. And although I do count upgrading into the list, for the most part, upgrading isn't really a huge consideration. In the Sur rune's part, however, the Sur rune can be upgraded into a Bur rune at a 2-to-1 ratio, which does give it a little bit of a bump, which is why it's above the Cham rune in the first place. Because it generally has at least that going for it. It can be transmuted up into a burr rune at a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you happen to find 2 of these, you can make yourself a slightly more useful rune. And when I say slightly, I mean a lot more useful. The burr rune is much higher up on the list for versatility. Next on the list is the Ist rune, which surprisingly has very little usefulness in the actual game as far as cube recipes. It has 0 cube recipes that it can be used in. It also has only 7 rune words that you can utilize this particular rune in. The main reason why Ist runes are considered more versatile than other runes and why they tend to have better value is just simply because they have Magic Find on them. That's the only and the main reason. And Magic Find can be gotten in a large variety of other places. And in fact, for some places, like for instance the Topaz, the Topaz rivals the Ist rune because it's much cheaper, easier to come by, and can be put in those places. In fact, the only place where the Ist rune is really better by a large margin than the Topaz is, of course, the weapon slot, where it gives 30% and the Topaz gives 0. The Ist rune is a very valuable rune. It is one of the runes that people use to gauge their currency on. It's just not a very versatile rune in terms of the actual game. If you are playing, like, say, single player by yourself, and you find an Ist rune, you have a total of 7 rune words that you can use that Ist rune in, and 0 cube recipes. So it doesn't really make it very high up the list. Moving on to the next one, we have the Gull rune. The Gull rune is likewise not very useful. It has 7 rune words, 0 cube recipes. The 20% bonus to attack rating isn't really that amazing, and neither is the 5% bonus to maximum poison resist. So overall, a not very useful rune. It does have a couple good recipes that it can be used in, of course. That's why it has a total of 7 recipes. Next on the list, and these are all kind of tied together because they're all at 7. So we're just going to like rattle them off here. So Ist rune is at 7. Sur rune is at 7. These are all kind of tied. Gull rune is also at 7. Foul rune also ties for 7. Now, Foul rune only has 6 recipes, but it does have 1 Herodric Cube recipe, which still brings it up to 7 total uses, essentially. And plus 10 strength is completely useless because you can get the same exact thing from, Ruby? Or, no, Ruby's Life. Amethyst? I think it's Amethyst. So, not really useful in terms of its stats either. Dole rune also has 7 cube recipes, and I could probably swap these around a bit. So there's 7 rune words and 0 recipes for Dole rune as well. Now, if I wanted to swap these around a bit to make them a little bit more interesting, because these are all tied. In fact, we have one more tie on the list, so let me put this one up here first. So the Neph rune is also tied in position 7. But the Neph rune has 5 rune words and 2 cube recipes, and 2 of those cube recipes are actually pretty good. Like, for instance, the Blood Gloves, which is one of the very popular ones. I would definitely move the Sur rune up here. The Dole rune would most likely go back here. The Foul would go above the Dole rune. The Gull would go probably above the Ist. Looking something like this. These are all tied together for 7, for the, what is this, 33rd, 32nd, 31st, 30th place. These are all tied for 30th place. And the Neph rune definitely has a little bit more versatility by those blood runes, so we're going to put it up a little bit higher. And then we have the Vex rune. The Vex rune is useful in 8 rune words, 0 cube recipes. It has a little bit more versatility. The Vex rune always kind of reminded me of a little penguin holding a stone, although some people said if you turn your head sideways it looks like a man in a boat. It kind of looks like both of them. I definitely think the Vex rune has some usefulness. Obviously, not only does it have a maximum fire resist, which is one of the most prevalent elements in the game, but it also is just simply a good rune with a lot of good rune words. 8 rune words in total with 0 cube recipes. The rune, on the other hand, is next, and it is also tied with the Vex rune for 7 rune words and 1 cube recipe. The 1 cube recipe being the upgrade recipe, which is actually pretty useful. And then we also have the Burr rune, which of course the Burr rune is very useful in terms of its stats. and it has damage reduction on it, and it also has Crushing Blow, which does make it more useful. However, it does have 8 runewords, 0 cube recipes, so it is solid in that 8 number between the Burr, and Vex. Obviously, the Burr rune is more useful than a Vex rune or a rune due to its stats alone. In fact, I might have to bump that one up just simply because of the stats on the item. But as far as its versatility in recipes, its versatility in actually being used for cube recipes and things like that, it is still only 8. Jaw Rune is next at 9. So Jaw Rune actually has 9 rune words that it can be put in, as opposed to Burr's 8 rune words, which makes Jaw slightly more useful. However, I often think that the rune words specifically used for Burr Rune tend to be a little bit more useful than Jaw rune words. So I think we're going to switch these. Then we are with the Low Rune. The Low Rune has a number of rune words of 10. It's a rather versatile rune word, rune, and the rune words that it's used in are rather versatile. There's quite a large number of them. Everything from grief to, like brand bow, I believe, and a couple other interesting ones. But a lot of the rune words that are actually being used here are actually useful. And that's kind of like the whole thing, is I'm trying to gauge the total number of useful rune words versus the total number of like useless rune words and total number of useful cube recipes. The Low Rune, unfortunately, does not have any cube recipes. It is at 0, so it's a total of 10. Then we have the Eld Rune. Yes, the lowly Eld Rune, which doesn't really have much usefulness at all, does it? Except for the fact that the Eld Rune is used in 9 rune words and is also used in 1 cube recipe, which makes it a total usefulness of 10. And of course, the Low Rune is definitely more useful than the Eld Rune, so we're going to swap those. The Lum Rune is also at 10 with 8 rune words and 2 cube recipes. And the Lum Rune has some pretty good cube recipes too, like being able to upgrade items. Trying to remember exactly right off the top of my head. Like, for instance, the upgrade recipe for armors, or is it Pul Lum? So it's the weapons, and then it's Ko Lem for the armor. So that's right. So Lum is also at 10, and of course Low is still better than that. And then we have the Hell Rune. The Hell Rune has 8 rune words and 2 cube recipes. And it's not a bad one either. There's a lot of good cube recipes, including, obviously, the ability to remove runes from a base, which allows you to recover those bases and use them again. So I am going to put that one above the Low Rune, just simply because it allows you to recover bases that you would otherwise have lost. And then we have the Ith Rune. The Ith Rune is used in 8 rune words and 2 cube recipes as well. It is also at a 10, but of course it's not as good as a Low Rune, so we're going to move that ahead. And that gives us next the Pul Rune. The Pul Rune is pretty useful due to its cube recipes. It has a lot of cube recipes. One of them is upgrading your weapons, which can actually be surprisingly good. It has 7 rune words and 3 cube recipes, believe it or not, for a total of 10. These are actually all tied, by the way. Which makes it very difficult to like place them all, because they all have essentially the same amount of versatility as the others. And of course, as I go forward, we may actually adjust these a little bit, because obviously it's not purely based on how many recipes and how many cube recipes are involved, but we'll have a final adjustment at the end. Then we have the L Rune, the lowly L Rune, which is also a versatility of 10. It has a total of 9 rune words that it's used in, and it has a total of 1 cube recipe for 10 usefulness at this particular point. It's one of those runes also that for some reason or another, when you find it, or when you need it, you never seem to have one. The Lem Rune is next at 11 total, with 8 rune words and 3 cube recipes, which is pretty impressive. And it also has some pretty good rune words as well, like Treachery, that are actually pretty valuable in the long run. Then we have the Soul Rune. The Soul Rune is one of the more useful runes in the game because it makes things like Insight. It has 9 rune words, 3 cube recipes. One of them is the Blood Ring, which is also very, very useful. And it has a total of 12 uses within the game, which I would consider to be, you know, like actually good. Those little baby potions are pissing me off. Next is the Mal Rune. The Mal Rune has 13 uses. It has 13 rune words, but it has 0 cube recipes. It actually is used in a lot of various recipes. Then we have the Ko Rune. The Ko Rune is used in 13 total recipes. It has 10 rune words and 3 cube recipes, which is pretty impressive. The Tier Rune doesn't have any Herodric Cube recipes, and I was not aware of that before I made this video. But it does have, however, 13 different rune words, which has been detached to, and it's fairly useful with the +2 mana after each kill, and gets shoved in a lot of stuff as you're leveling up. Next on the list is the Eth Rune, which over the years I have definitely seen as more and more and more valuable with that negative 25% target's defense, which has proved to be one of the best ways to increase your attack rating, is just to not increase your attack rating. The best way to increase attack rating is to reduce the monster's defense, and that way you don't need as much attack rating anymore. It's in 10 rune words, 3 cube recipes for a total of 13. It's pretty much tied with the Tier Rune, as well as tied with the Ko Rune and the Mal Rune, which are all at 13 usefulness. Next on the list is the Thul Rune, which is also tied at 13. The Thul Rune has 10 rune words and 3 cube recipes, and it's a pretty useful rune word, list of rune words overall. Very, very good rune and a lot of usefulness there. Next on the list is the Io at 14, which is above these others, these little poor peasant runes. And it has a total of 14 rune word recipes, 0 cube recipes, and it's not bad. 14 rune words for one little rune. It increased dramatically when they made the helmets, which was one of the things that really pushed it over the edge, because now the Io rune not only has things like black and white as rune words, but it also has things like bulwark and cure helmets, which pushed it up over the top. The Shael rune has 13 rune words, 2 cube recipes, and it has a total of 15 useful rune words or cube recipes that it's used in. And on top of that, it seems like you're always burning the dang things. Like, they seem to drop all the time, don't get me wrong. And while I'm not taking into account the rarity of the rune here, I'm only taking into account the usefulness of the rune. The Shael rune is definitely one of those runes, which is not particularly very rare, but it also happens to be very useful in that you use it up all the dang time. Upgrading armors, putting them in your treacheries, putting them in your hustles, putting them in all sorts of various things in the game. And it just seems like you always need a Shael rune at some point or another. And on top of that, it also gives faster block rate, increased attack speed, and faster hit recovery, which can all be useful at various times for sockets in your equipment. In fact, a lot of people will literally just take 6 Shaels and throw it into like a phase blade just to make one of the fastest weapons that's ever existed, which is pretty darn good. Next on the list is the Ort, the lowly Ort, which seems to be one of the most common runes in the game. I swear it feels like I always have a sea of Orts at some point, and maybe there's a reason for that, because it's used in 9 rune words and 6 cube recipes for a total of 15 usefulness on the index here. So 15 different things that you can use an Ort rune with that are actually useful, by the way. And this is, of course, including all the stuff, or excluding all the stuff that I removed that the Ort rune was used in. In fact, I can go over, at the end of this, I'll go over the list of the pure list without any of my reductions, just for fun. And then we have the Am rune. The Am rune is 16 total, which is pretty impressive. It has 11 rune words, 5 cube recipes for a total of 16 of Versatility. And it makes sense. The Am rune definitely has a lot of things that you can potentially use it in. It's also used in some of the most common rune words in the game, like the Spirit rune word, if I remember correctly. Just a really good rune word overall, a rune overall. And if you have an Am rune in your inventory, there's a very good chance you're going to be using it on something. There's some good crafted recipes. There's some good cube recipes that have to do with other things. And all of them very, very good for the Am rune. Now we come to the number 2 slot. So number 2 out of all these runes is actually the Tal rune. Now, it was actually a tie between the Tal and the Rao. However, I think that the Tal rune, because it upgrades into the Ral rune, if I remember correctly, is definitely number 2 on this list. The Tal rune has 9 total rune words and 9 cube recipes for a total of 18 total versatility. And it definitely seems to be used in a large majority of things. And this is, of course, removing a large majority of the rune words and the recipes that Tal rune is used in. It actually ends up somewhere around like 20 to 23, I think, when in its full grandeur. But there was definitely some things that had to be snipped from the list because they weren't very useful. Which leaves our number 1 spot to the Ral rune. That's right, the lowly Ral rune has taken the kingship at 8 rune words, 10 cube recipes, with a total of 18 versatility. And as Bobby Billions says all the time, Ral rune, best rune. And it turns out he wasn't wrong. The Ral rune not only has some of the best recipes in the game, like for instance the Caster Amulet, it also is used in 8 different rune words in the game and 10 different cube recipes. It can be up transmuted, of course. You can up transmute Tals into Rals, and I took that into account as well because Tals, of course, tied with Rals at 18 as well. But since you can take 3 Tals and turn them into a Ral, that pretty much adds to Ral's versatility even more, because one of the most useful runes in the game can be transmuted up into one of the most useful runes in the game. So your number 2 can just be translated up into a number 1. Now, looking at this list and seeing the order that we ended up with definitely kind of surprised me. Like, I would not have expected Zod to be at the bottom of the list of versatility. And I definitely think that the Zod rune deserves to be a little bit higher, I think, than it was ranked, simply because it does have the ability to make weapons indestructible. I don't really care too much about the armor side of things because an ethereal armor just gives you more defense. It's not that big of a deal. But an ethereal weapon can give you an insanely large amount of damage. So I do feel like the Zod rune probably belongs somewhere a lot higher than it was given credit for. Probably somewhere around maybe here. Maybe not more valuable or more useful than a Jaw rune or a Burr rune, for instance, but definitely still very useful for what it's capable of doing with weapons. On top of this, we also have things like, well, I mean, honestly, I can't really argue with the list all that much. Let me bring up my list. I'm going to bring up the list without the filters. So this is the list without the filters, without me removing anything from it. It took me a while to compile this list, so yeah. So the Ral rune originally had 23 usefulness, but I had to subtract quite a bit from it for rune words and recipes that were basically just not useful. Tal rune was originally 20, Am rune was originally 20, Eth rune was 18, Ort rune was 18, Thul 17, and so forth and so on. And as you can see, there definitely is a big difference between this list and my final outcome, because in this list, the Eth rune is all the way up here at number 4, and as you can clearly see, the Eth rune ended up much lower because quite a few of the rune words and recipes that this particular rune had access to were just not useful. Now, is this an end-all be-all list that covers everything, including like rarity and the value of the items? No, it's not. But if you found yourself in a solo self-found run and you said to yourself, like, which runes should I keep on me at all times? Well, I think the answer to that question is pretty clear. These runes right here definitely represent some of the more commonly used and useful runes within the game. Every single one of these, from the Ral rune to the Hell rune, just have a very large number of rune words that they are useful in, which allows them to be just very good to have with you at all times. Like, almost like having like a Swiss Army knife with you, or having, like a just like an everyday carry of useful objects. Like what do you carry with you every single day, like in the real world? Like, I think at this point, I want all my characters to have Ral runes with them at all times, because I've realized at this point that Ral runes are one of the most useful runes in the game, bar none. Ral rune, best rune. Whereas things like the Ohm rune, the Cham rune, the Dol rune, the Foul rune, the Ist rune tend to have the least usefulness in the game. Even the Ist rune, like I was pretty surprised to find out that the Ist rune really didn't have a lot that it was used for. What do we use Ist runes for? We put them in sockets and we use them as currency. But like the actual number of recipes and, well, rune words that we actually put Ist runes in is relatively low. To the point where this rune tends to be a lot less useful than its value would seem to indicate. Now, of course, in the grand scheme of things, the value of these runes is determined by their rarity. And, well, a rune like the Ral rune, which is extremely valuable but also extremely common, gets burned up relatively quickly. Whereas a rune like the Ohm rune, which is valuable but not as useful, doesn't get burned up as quickly because it has less that it is used for. But the things that it is used for are at least useful enough that it does get burned up in significant quantity equal to its rarity, if that makes any sense, right? The runes don't have to be burned up like exceedingly fast. The runes only have to be burned up essentially quickly enough to deplete their overall supply. Think about the Shael rune as an example, which is definitely one of the more widely used runes within the game across multiple rune words, across multiple avenues like crafting recipes, the actual like upgrade recipes, the rune words that they're made in, and also just socketed in random piece of equipment on a regular basis. But it's also surprisingly easy to come by. And so eventually you're going to end up with a large number of these despite its frequent use case scenario. Same thing with the Ral rune, even though you will find a lot of these due to its usefulness in things like the caster amulet recipe and some very other good recipes as well, including quite a few rune words. You're going to be burning up Ral runes by the hundreds, if not thousands, at some point. For those of you who are crafters, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And the funny thing is that even though this might be one of the least valuable runes within the game, and even though this is technically one of the most valuable runes in the game, this rune can create an item which is many, many times more valuable than this rune will ever be on its own. So maybe the Ral rune does indeed deserve its spot at number one. Let me know what you guys think about this list. This was just a fun little side project for me. I really wanted to get an idea of like how useful each rune was in terms of its versatility within the game, and like an understanding essentially of like why these runes are valuable. How many rune words the runes were actually used in, how many crafting recipes they were used in, how many useful rune words they were used in, how many useful crafting recipes they were in, and this is the result that I came up with. I think it's a funny result at the very least, and it's not really indicative of any specific like reasoning. Like you wouldn't sit here and be like, okay, well, Ral rune's number one, so it's worth 30 burr runes. I mean, that's not really how it works. But if you're playing through on a solo self-found or just single player in general, and you happen to find runes, you will kind of have a better understanding through this of which runes are generally going to be more useful to you to give you the most number of options at your fingertips, essentially, to be able to craft and create what you want. And the truth of the matter is these down here are the ones that give you the most options, and these up here are the ones that give you the least number of options. Do they still give you options? Yes, they definitely still give you options, but less options. Far less options than you get with these. Now, granted, all of the rune words are a combination of runes, and at the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about a combination of runes, you're always going to need more than a certain number, right? You're not going to be able to just have Rals or just have Tals or whatever. But if you had these right here, I would wager a bet that just these down here would probably give you more options than pretty much everything up here. More crafting recipes, more rune words, more like pretty much everything that you need for your character as opposed to what these are going to offer you. In fact, I remember distinctly one time I was playing through a run on my Necromancer. little bit of anecdotal evidence, and maybe you guys can provide your own anecdotal evidence. I found myself a Vex rune, and I also found myself a Mal rune. And I'm playing through on my Necromancer, and I'm sitting here trying to think what I can use this Vex rune and this Mal rune for. And I ended up completing the entire solo self-found Players 8 run, and I never made anything with the Mal rune or the Vex rune. And do you know why? Because there was nothing useful enough for me to use on that Necromancer that I could create with these particular runes. And the moral of the story sometimes is that just because you find a high rune, like just because you find a Burr rune or just because you find a Jaw rune, doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually going to be useful. Because 9 times out of 10, you may not have any of the other runes that you need to actually create the rune word, right? Whereas down here with these runes, there is a lot you can do with these runes. In fact, we could even probably include some of these into the list, like Lem, I think, is definitely one that should be included. Soul should be included in the list down below. L gets included because it's very common and obviously easy to come by. Pull, Hell, I don't really know if Mal can be included, but maybe. But these runes right here definitely seem to be among the most useful and most versatile runes within the game, with the most number of Herodic Cube recipes, the most number of pretty much everything. To give you an example, let's do a little bit of calculation here as to the total number of recipes that this represents. So we need a nice little calculator here. And what we're going to do is we're going to add up all the recipes or all the totals for everything at the top of this list. So down to the Hell rune, and this is we are going to be using the revised list, of course. So 18 plus 18 plus 16, and of course, the interesting thing is that this actually multiplies slightly because the more runes you have, the more usefulness you get. And let's just keep going. And I think that's it, or is it one more? I think it's one more. Or 2 more. I rearranged them slightly. So we got, that was the Lem rune. We got 1, 2 more. We got 2 more. So 10 and 10. So plus 10, plus 10. So we've got a total of 204 possible combinations of Runewords, essentially, and also Herodic Cube recipes that you can potentially use, like just with this combination right here. And I did include the Mal rune into it, which is a lot of freaking possible combinations. Yes, all these up here are useful. Like, and I feel like I'll get feedback from this. People will be like, "You fool! How could you dare put the Ohm rune at the bottom of the list?" And well, I mean, I didn't necessarily judge the Ohm rune based on its capability or what it could create specifically, but just simply how useful it was in total. Like, if I found an Ohm rune as I was playing through the game, what are the possibilities that I would actually be able to use that Ohm rune in my build? And the moral of the story is that the Ohm rune has very limited number of use case scenarios. Like it is one of the runes that only has 6 rune words total, and there's no guarantee that I will be able to create any of those rune words. On top of this, the 50% enhanced damage, while nice, might not necessarily even be better than something like a Shael rune, which allows me to get faster attack speed, which might be more important to me at that particular time period than an Ohm rune would ever be. The Ohm rune does have some endgame usefulness with that 50% enhanced damage, and of course, once you have all the runes that you need to be able to create, say like CTA as an example, because, I think CTA is one of them that has Ohm rune in it. Once you have enough runes to actually create one of these rune words, then yeah, the Ohm rune can definitely be useful. But in a general playthrough, you find an Ohm rune, and then you sit there and you think to yourself, wow, what can I use this in? And then you look up the 6 rune words that you can potentially make an Ohm rune out of. And you know what? We can do that real quick. It doesn't really hurt anything. So let's bring up Diablo2.io as an example. and we take a look at our Runeword database, go to runes, and then we select the Ohm, and we end up with our 6 runes, or 6 rune words, right? Well, for the call to arms, we need a Mal rune and an Ist rune, which is very likely not to happen if you're playing by yourself. For faith, you need a Jah Alem, which, again, is very likely not to happen if you're playing by yourself. Chaos could potentially be makeable with Fal and although Fal and can sometimes be kind of hard to come by, and Chaos isn't really that amazing of a rune word. It's okay. Bramble is Ohm Sur, so you need a Sur rune in combination with an Ohm rune. Again, not really very easy to create. Exile is Vex Ohm Ist, which Ist Vex is still very difficult to come by. Lo Cham for Doom, and Foul Ort Jaw for Famine. And as you can see, the Ohm rune just tends to be less useful as a result, just simply because, yes, you can create certain rune words with it, but most of the time you're not going to be able to create those rune words. That's the problem. And it's an interesting list. It's one that I may still revise at some point, because of course there's a lot that needed to be taken into account. And trust me when I tell you this, oh, I took a lot into account for this list. I took into account the usefulness of the rune words. I eliminated a large number of rune words that I considered to be useless. I took into account the usefulness of the rune itself, as well as the usefulness of the Heraldric Cube recipes, eliminating certain Heraldric Cube recipes from the list. I also took into account the usefulness in crafting recipes, removing certain crafting recipes from the list, and this is what I came up with. I feel like there's certain things to be said about like specific rune words that could be pushing the runes up a little bit, up the list a little bit. Like, for instance, the low rune, as an example, is utilized in Grief, but the low rune is still placed very high on the list by comparison. I'll have a full listing of the rankings and also the ties for you guys in the description of the video. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching. Be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And as always, keep watching.